Jackson Miles never asked much from the world, just his land, his dogs, and a little room to breathe. Burklaw Ridge offered him all that and more. Towering pines, a whispering creek out back, and the nearest neighbor was half a mile down the dirt road. It was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted out of politics, noise, and nosy neighbors. So, when Jackson stepped onto his front porch one morning and saw deep claw marks slashed into the cedar planks, his stomach knotted. The sun was barely up, casting long shadows from the barn, and a chill breeze pushed the wind chimes into a soft warning hum. He knelt down, running a calloused hand across the grooves. For deep tracks, each space wider than a man's hand. No mistaking what made them. It was a bear. Not passing through, it had come right to the house. Jackson stood slowly, eyes scanning the tree line. The birds were quiet. His dogs hadn't barked once last night. That wasn't like them. He walked straight to the shed and pulled up footage from the trail cams. The screen flickered, and there was a full-grown black bear. It had wandered in at 16 a.m., sniffed the steps, paced along the porch, then pressed its weight against the door. It lingered longer than any bear should, like it had a reason to be there. Jackson had lived through enough Colorado winters to know how wildlife behaved. This wasn't hungry. It was curious, almost trained. His pulse quickened. Later that morning, he drove down to town for supplies. At the general store, he bumped into Eliza Porter, the only other rancher who still tolerated the HOA. She raised an eyebrow when she saw him. "You hear about the board's new wildlife control idea?" she asked, tongue thick with sarcasm. Jackson shook his head. "They're saying we need to let nature reclaim some of the ridge. Karen's idea, of course. You know how she talks about rewilding, like it's some TED Talk, and we're now living right next to apex predators." Jackson didn't laugh. He just paid for his fencing wire and left out by noon. He was back home and things were getting stranger. His satellite internet had gone down. The keypad on the front gate wasn't responding. One of his solar panels had been tilted out of alignment. Then he found the track's blueprints, size 11, leading from the gravel road around the barn and straight into the woods behind the property. He followed them, rifle in hand, boots crunching over dry needles. A few hundred yards in, he stopped. There, sitting on a flat stone like some grim offering, was a pile of raw meat, still red, still dripping, bait, positioned downwind of his house. His breath froze in his throat. This wasn't an accident. Someone had brought that bear here, and they wanted it back. That night, Jackson didn't sleep. He sat in his living room, shotgun across his lap, lights off, waiting. He left the porch light on this time, connected to a motion sensor, around 3:40 a.m. It flicked on. Outside stood the same bear, only now, Jackson was watching it through the narrow window slants, and behind the bear, just inside the forest, he caught movement. A figure. Someone standing still, almost still, watching the animal. Whoever it was ducked away as the bear sniffed around, then slunk off into the trees once more. The bear followed minutes later. Jackson stood in silence. His heart wasn't pounding from fear. It was boiling with anger. This wasn't nature. This was a message, and he was about to send one back. He walked to the garage and unlocked the old steel cabinet he hadn't opened in years. Inside, game traps, a spare trail cam, and a few devices he hadn't used since his military days. If someone was turning the wild against him, he was ready to make it personal. He wasn't just protecting his home. He was hunting for the truth now. They thought fear would drive him out, but they forgot one thing. Jackson doesn't run. He tracks. Stick around for part 2, where a simple trap changes everything. The morning after the bear's second visit, Jackson Miles sat at his kitchen table sketching out a plan on an old feed invoice. He drew the layout of his property, marked the locations of his remaining trail cams, and then circled the area behind the barn where the raw meat had been left. It wasn't just where the bear had appeared, it was where someone had stood in the shadows, watching. He wasn't dealing with a rogue predator. He was dealing with people, and that meant the rules were different. Jackson stepped outside, his breath visible in the cool air. He walked toward the tree line carrying a metal case, his old wildlife surveillance kit, a relic from his army days, modified for civilian use. It didn't just capture video. It recorded thermal signatures and scents with his phone in real time. He mounted it to a tree facing the clearing where the bait had been left and added a second camera on the opposite side, facing the road. Anyone approaching would be caught on one of them. That afternoon, he dug a shallow trench near the bait site, not a trap for the bear, but for someone on two legs. He lined it with fallen branches, covered it with leaves and dirt, and placed a new slab of meat in the middle. His ranch may have been quiet, but Jackson wasn't anymore. He was on the offensive now. By midnight, he was back in his living room, phone in hand, screen open to his camera feed. At 3:12 a.m., the thermocam flared to life. A sheep moved into the clearing, not the bear. A person. They crept forward, flashlight in hand, scanning the woods. The figure wore a hoodie and gloves, crouched low as they moved toward the bait. Jackson zoomed in. It was Kevin Willoughby, Karen's nephew, the same guy who'd been slapped with a trespassing complaint last year for driving his dirt bike through someone's vegetable garden. And now here he was, on Jackson's land, sneaking meat into the woods like he was feeding a pet. Jackson recorded everything. Then he watched as Kevin took out a small plastic bottle, something slick and clear, and poured it over the bait. Bear scent. Jackson recognized it instantly. A chemical attractant used by some illegal hunters to lure wildlife close. Kevin had just broken 3 state laws in one night. The next morning, Jackson walked the footage straight to the county ranger's office. He handed over the thermal footage, camera timestamps, and a detailed report of the past 3 nights. The ranger, a no-nonsense woman named Deputy Harlan, sat through the entire playback in complete silence. When it ended, she turned to him and said, "This is a felony, and if this was organized by the whole board, that makes it criminal conspiracy." Jackson nodded once. "They didn't just want me scared. They wanted me gone." That evening, Jackson returned home and found a letter taped to his front gate. Notice of HOA violation, unsafe structure, and unapproved security devices. The paper flapped in the wind, signed in Karen Willoughby's looping cursive. He ripped it down and smiled. They still had no idea he'd seen Kevin. They had no idea the ranger was already preparing charges. But Jackson wasn't finished yet. If they wanted to play games, he was going to host the championship. He added new locks to his gate. He installed floodlights on motion sensors across the property. And then, to really stir the pot, he put up a large wooden sign outside the ranch entrance. "Trespassers will be photographed. Survivors will be prosecuted." Word spread fast in Berklaw Ridge. But the biggest move was yet to come. Jackson had discovered a secret, something buried in the HOA's own bylaws, tucked in an old digital file folder from 5 years ago. Something that not only explained their sudden obsession with his land, but hinted at why they were willing to go this far to drive him out. He printed the document. It was going to blow the whole plan wide open. They sent a bear to do their dirty work. But Jackson didn't just trap a predator, he found their motive. In part 3, the real reason they want his land is revealed. And it's uglier than anyone expected. Stick with it. You don't want to miss the turn this story takes. Next, Jackson Miles has seen enough crooked games to know that people don't risk jail time for small reasons. Bears weren't cheap to wrangle. Infractions from the State Wildlife Board were serious business. Kevin stung with the scent and bait alone could cost someone thousands in fines, even jail time. So why was the HOA willing to gamble so much just to push one man off his own land? The answer was buried in the bylaws, literally. It took Jackson for hours of digging through archive folders. On the HOA's public site, years of meeting minutes, forgotten resolutions, scanned PDFs with coffee stains and typos. Most of it was junk. But then, tucked into a file labeled Amendment Drafts 2018, he found it. A clause titled Parcel 12B, Conservation Redevelopment Incentive. It read like a riddle. But Jackson knew legalese when he saw it. If parcel 1-B his land became uninhabitable or unoccupied for more than 90 consecutive days, it could be reclassified. Once reclassified, the HOA had authority to integrate it into the Berklaw Greenbelt Initiative. In short, if Jackson left or was scared off, it wouldn't just sit empty. The HOA could absorb it and sell conservation credits to developers looking to offset their own environmental impact. It wasn't about Jackson. It was about profit. And the plan had already started. He found notes from the past HOA meetings, one where Karen had proposed Greenbelt expansion as outlined in long-term vision, and another with a line that turned his stomach. Parcel 12B may be resolved by Q3 if natural deterrents prove effective. Natural deterrents. That was code for the bear. Jackson leaned back in his chair, the printed page clenched in his fist. The entire wildlife story was a front. They didn't want harmony with nature. They wanted to flip his land into cash, using environmental law to get around zoning restrictions. He had the motive. Now he needed the proof. He called Deputy Harlan. An hour later, she and the state game warden were sitting at his kitchen table reviewing the documents and the thermal cam footage. The warden's face tightened when he saw the scent bait. That's manufactured lore. You can't buy this without a license, and even then, using it like this is illegal on private land. Deputy Harlan flipped through the paperwork inside. You sure you want to push this? Jackson nodded. They came at me with an apex predator. I'm not letting them do this to someone else next year. She stood up. Then we'll get a warrant. That night, Berklaw Ridge was quieter than usual. Kevin's truck was gone from the Willoughby driveway. No porch lights on. No HOA patrols coasting past Jackson's fence pretending to check mailboxes. But inside the Willoughby home, things were far from quiet. Karen paced in her den, shouting at someone on speakerphone. Kevin stood in the corner, arms crossed, sulking. Like a teenager caught stealing candy, they knew something had gone wrong. They just didn't know how much Jackson had uncovered. The next day, the warrant came through. Wildlife officials raided the HOA maintenance shed first. Inside they found crates of scent bait, a bear trap unused but illegal on residential land, and several invoices to a third-party wildlife service in Idaho that had gone out of business in 2020. Deputy Harlan brought the hammer down with perfect timing just as the HOA was holding its monthly board meeting. Jackson didn't attend. He didn't need to. The headlines the next morning did the talking for him. HOA leaders investigated for wildlife harassment and land grab plot. Neighbors, who'd been silent for years, suddenly found their voices. Eliza stopped by that afternoon with a homemade pie and a few printed petitions. Karen's going to have a hard time explaining this one, she said with a grin. But Jackson knew it wasn't over. Karen was still out there, and people like her don't just give up when they get embarrassed. They dig in, and sure enough, that night, a motion light snapped on outside his barn. Jackson grabbed his rifle and stepped out onto the porch. He expected an animal. What he found was a man in a suit holding a clipboard. Just when Jackson thought he'd exposed it all, someone higher up showed up at his gate. Parfa reveals the powerful figure behind the HOA's plan and what they offer him to walk away. Stick around. You haven't seen the final player yet. Jackson didn't lower the rifle, not right away. The man on the other side of the gate looked polished to be local. His boots were clean. His coat looked tailored. And the clipboard he carried wasn't the kind you got from a hardware store. It was leather bound. The kind used by people who signed deals, not delivered packages. Name's Dennis Langford. The man called through the gate. I represent a conservation development fund. I believe we might have mutual interests. Jackson stepped forward slowly, boots crunching the gravel. You're here at midnight. That's not mutual, it's suspicious. Dennis chuckled politely, but it was the kind of laugh that didn't touch his eyes. Fair point. But I figured you're the kind of man who doesn't like office hours. I wanted to speak before lawyers started showing up. Jackson kept his voice calm. About what? Langford held up the clipboard. About parcel 1-B. Jackson blinked. You mean my land? Yes, of course. Dennis smiled like he was selling luxury windows. And I fully acknowledge the recent chaos we had no intention of involving. The way it's played out. The board got creative, unnecessarily so. But I believe we can resolve things amicably. Jackson folded his arms. You with the HOA? I'm with their funder, Langford said. You could call me the money behind the curtain. That told Jackson everything he needed. Karen wasn't acting alone. She'd been pressured, maybe paid by people like Langford to target his property. And if they were sending in a suit, now, it meant the scandal had shaken them. Langford unclipped a folder from the leather pad and slid it under the gate. $2.8 million, he said. Clean buyout. You walk away. No fines, no lawsuits, no more bears. Jackson didn't touch the folder. You think this is about money? He said. Langford kept smiling. Everything is about money, even morals. Jackson stepped forward and pushed the folder back under the gate. My great-grandfather built this ranch. My dad rebuilt it after the fires in '98, and I put in 10 years keeping this land what it is. You think I'm walking away because some HOA crook let a bear loose on my porch? Langford shrugged. I figured you might. Most men do when they realize the scope of what they're up against. We don't just own a boardroom, Mr. Miles. We own zoning boards, surveyors, permit departments. A few more months of pressure, and that ranch of yours becomes a financial burden, not a legacy. Jackson narrowed his eyes. I'm not most men. Langford sighed and flipped a page on his clipboard. Well, then I guess we'll go the long way. He turned without waiting for a response and walked calmly back to his vehicle. A black SUV with no plates. Jackson watched the taillights disappear down the hill, heart pounding. Not from fear, from rage. This wasn't just a land dispute. This was a coordinated push, a machine built to squeeze people out and convert nature into capital. He walked back to the house and picked up the phone. Deputy Harlan, he said. Once the line connected, you ever hear of a guy named Dennis? Langford. There was a pause. Yeah. He's got ties to a lobbying group down in Denver. Big player in greenwashed land grabs. Why? He just offered me a bribe. Did you take anything from him? No. But I've got it all on camera. Keep the footage safe. We'll need it. The next morning, the fire marshal arrived unannounced. Someone had filed an anonymous complaint that Jackson was hoarding flammable materials near his barn. It was false, but it tied him up for half a day. Then the county inspector showed up to review a violation about septic drainage. Then a drone flew over his house 3 times in one afternoon, buzzing just low enough to make the dogs bark nonstop. They weren't hiding anymore. They were turning up the heat, but Jackson didn't flinch. He knew they wanted a reaction, panic, a mistake they could twist into leverage. So instead, he did the opposite. He invited the press. They sent a suit. He sent a camera crew. In part 5, Jackson flipped the spotlight, and what he reveals about Karen shocks the whole town. Stick around. The truth's about to hit harder than any bear. By the time the local news van pulled up outside Jackson Miles's ranch, the morning fog was just lifting from the valley. He met the crew at the gate, shook hands with the young reporter, and led them up the drive where the bear claw marks on the porch were still visible and varnished, unhidden, just like he planned. They started filming immediately. Jackson stood with his arms crossed beside the porch, speaking directly to the camera. I moved here to live off the land. My only mistake was buying property that HOA had plans for. The footage showed everything. The bear claw scratches, the thermocam clips of Kevin with the scent bait, and Jackson's copy of the 2018 HOA amendment regarding Parcel 1-B. Then came the money shot recordings of Dennis Langford at Jackson's gate, trying to buy him out at midnight like a bad movie villain. By noon, the segment aired online with the headline, Bear used as weapon in HOA land plot. The video spread like brush fire. Comments flooded in from across the state, and within hours, 2 more residents of Berklaw Ridge came forward, claiming they'd also been pressured by the HOA to relocate for conservation efforts. Jackson's phone buzzed with non-stop calls, but what mattered most was who wasn't calling. Karen Willoughby. She hadn't said a word, not to the press, not to her fellow board members, and not to the police. That silence didn't last. The next day, Jackson was at the feed store picking up fencing staples when Eliza Porter walked in, her face pale. "You need to see this," she said, holding out her phone. It was a screen recording from the HOA's private Facebook group. Someone had leaked a voice memo. Karen's voice, unmistakable and shaking with anger, filled the air. "Jackson's asking for it. He thinks he's got the whole town on his side now, but they don't know what kind of man he is. We gave him a chance to leave peacefully. He wanted a fight. He'll regret it." Jackson didn't flinch, but Eliza looked nervous. "She's coming unhinged. That's not just a woman on edge, that's someone unraveling." Back at the ranch, Jackson checked his cameras and security feed. He reinforced the barn doors and walked the fence line twice before sundown. The pressure was building, and he didn't like how quiet the other side had gone. That evening, just as the sun dipped behind the ridge, the whole board held an emergency meeting. It was streamed live for transparency, part of their damage control campaign. Jackson watched from his living room. Karen took the floor, standing behind a podium in a blazer to stiff for her posture. Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "This board has always acted in the best interests of Berklaw Ridge," she said. "The recent allegations are unfounded and exaggerated. Mr. Miles has created a narrative that simply doesn't reflect our intentions." Jackson scoffed. He knew the script before she even finished it. Deny, refrain, play victim. But then, someone stood up from the audience, a man Jackson didn't recognize, older, bald, with a faded army tattoo on his neck. "Karen," he said loudly, "you didn't seem so innocent when you bragged to me at the bar about flipping the ranch for green credits." The room went still. Karen blinked. "I don't recall." "Oh, you remember," the man said. "You laughed about how the bear would do the hard work for you. I got the whole thing on my dash cam. You were yelling it across the parking lot." Several audience members gasped. Phones started rising, recording. Karen's smile finally cracked. In the days that followed, everything spiraled. The news picked up the dashcam footage. State investigators reopened a civil fraud probe connected to the Berklaw Greenbelt Fund. Dennis Langford vanished, his number disconnected, website taken down. Karen was finally forced to resign, but even as she stepped down, something about her final words stuck with Jackson. "I was just following the plan. You think this ends with me? You don't even know who's really behind it." She fell, but she didn't fall alone. In part 6, Jackson discovers the ranch wasn't just land, it was leverage, and someone far bigger is coming to collect. Don't look away. The real threat is just arriving. Jackson didn't sleep much the night Karen resigned. It should have felt like a win, but it didn't. Her final words echoed in his head, gnawing at him. "You don't even know who's really behind it." And that wasn't just paranoia. It was a warning. 2 days later, a black SUV pulled up to the edge of Jackson's property, different from Langford's. The windows were darker, the tires bigger, armored. It didn't have plates either. Just a simple gold decal on the side. North Pine Environmental Development Group. Jackson didn't greet the driver. He just stood by the fence, arms crossed, waiting. The man who stepped out wasn't trying to hide who he was. Harlan Groves. Jackson knew the name. Former state senator, now a multi-million-dollar consultant and corporate fixer. He'd heard about Groves before, always mentioned in whispers. Usually after lawsuits vanished or permits were mysteriously approved. Groves walked up with a practiced smile and a briefcase that probably cost more than Jackson's barn. "Mr. Miles," he said, like they were old friends, "I think it's time we stop dancing around and talk like men." Jackson didn't answer. Groves took that as permission to keep going. What Karen did was unprofessional, sloppy, even. She acted without approval, and we've already issued internal sanctions against her. "You mean you cut her loose?" Jackson said flatly. Groves tilted his head. "Let's not get caught up in the politics of accountability. I'm here to clean up." He opened the briefcase on the hood of his vehicle. Inside were papers, legal documents, property transfer forms, checks already printed with Jackson's name. $5 million untaxed, clean. You can move anywhere in the country. We'll even throw in relocation assistance and 2-year security detail. Jackson raised an eyebrow. Security detail. Rose nodded. Once this story gets national traction, you'll be a target. Not from us, from people who want what you've got and think they can get it by force. He leaned in. This ranch isn't just land anymore, Mr. Miles. It's leverage, political, financial, symbolic. Every development deal on this side of the valley gets delayed as long as you're on this ridge. The longer you stay, the more expensive the delay becomes. Jackson stared at the check. The number was life-changing. But his mind wasn't on the money, it was on what Groves had just admitted. They weren't here for nature. They weren't here to protect wildlife. They were here because this land stopped them from expanding, and they were willing to spin a bear attack, manipulate a board, and break laws just to move one man out of the way. Jackson picked up the check, stared at it, then tore it straight down the middle. You want this land, he said. Come through the front gate like everyone else, bring a warrant or a bulldozer. But I'm not selling, and I'm not moving. Groves didn't flinch. He just sighed and closed the briefcase. I hope we wouldn't end up at this point, he said, turning back to his car. But if you're going to make it a war, I assure you we play for keeps. Jackson watched him go. This wasn't a fight over a fence anymore. This was a siege. The next day, strange things started happening. His water pressure dropped by half. The electric co-op claimed remote service delays even though the grid had been stable for years. An inspector cited him for an unregistered well, a technicality that hadn't been enforced since 1995. They were tightening the noose, but Jackson didn't panic. He adapted. He brought in volunteers, veterans, former neighbors, even strangers, who had seen his story online and offered to help. They repaired the fence, hauled water in by hand, installed solar backups. And all the while, Jackson documented everything. He handed over a copy of the torn check to Deputy Harlan. He sent the footage of Groves to the state attorney general's office. He contacted an investigative podcast and gave them full access to the trail cam archives, whole minutes and whistleblower statements. If they wanted a war, he'd give them one, but not on their terms. This was no longer just about saving his ranch. It was about exposing the machine. They sent the politician. He answered with the people. In Part 7, Jackson's resistance ignites something bigger than Berklaw Ridge, and the next move? It isn't his. It's theirs, and it's explosive. The following morning, Jackson sat in silence inside his barn office, reviewing trail cam footage from the night before. He hadn't slept. The storm had passed, but the evidence it blew in was clearer than any confession. He paused the video. There was Karen, Becky, and Phil standing by the chain-link fence at 12 a.m. The video clearly showed them opening the gate with a key and shooing something out of a transport trailer. Seconds later, the unmistakable shape of a bear lumbered toward the edge of the frame. Phil even gave it a push with the butt of a broom. Jackson leaned back in his chair. The HOA had done the unthinkable, and now he had proof. But before taking this to the sheriff, he made a call to someone the HOA never expected to hear from again, Ranger Colby Dean, a wildlife officer who'd once patrolled this mountain region. Before being reassigned after a messy HOA complaint, led by none other than Karen herself, Colby had never forgotten it. Colby arrived an hour later in a weathered truck, his hat pulled low and a coffee thermos in hand. Still got my boots muddy for the right cause, he said, stepping into the barn office. Jackson didn't waste time. He showed him the footage, along with photos of paw prints, the gate latch tampered with, and one critical detail Karen had overlooked. The bear had a yellow tag in its ear. Government property. Colby leaned in, eyes narrowing. That tag's from Yellowstone relocation. This bear was part of a recovery program. You can't just release it. That's a felony. Together, they compiled a report, and by noon, they were in the sheriff's office handing over a full case file. Sheriff Ada glanced over the folder, then looked at Colby. I assume you're backing this all the way. Colby nodded. I'll testify. They used a wild animal as a weapon. That's not just HOA drama, that's federal. By evening, the ranch was swarming with activity, but not the kind Jackson feared. Deputies visited each HOA board member's home, with search warrants in hand. Karen's house was the last stop when the officers approached. She was having tea on her porch in a bright yellow sundress, chatting on the phone. "What's this about?" she asked, smiling wide like she was greeting campaign supporters. "Animal endangerment, trespassing, reckless endangerment, federal wildlife violations," the deputy replied without ceremony. The smile vanished. Karen froze, her hands twitching. Near the cup, "You can't be serious," but it was serious enough for cuffs. Inside her home, officers discovered a small notebook on her desk. It had detailed plans written out. Release at midnight. Gate unlocked. Use Phil's trailer. No one sees it. No one knows. Dates, times, diagrams, all in her handwriting. That was the final nail. The community watched in stunned silence as Karen was led away in handcuffs, her phone falling from her purse and clattering down the steps. Phil and Becky were already in, holding, refusing to speak without lawyers. But the damage had been done. Back at the ranch, Jackson stood by the pasture fence as the sun set, Colby beside him. The silence felt earned this time. "Thought you should know," Colby said, pulling a folder from under his arm. "That bear's safe. Tracked him down, sedated him this morning. He's being returned to the sanctuary, unharmed." Jackson nodded. Slowly, "You did good, Jackson, real good." Folks like that, they always think they can walk over everyone because no one's ever pushed back. Jackson looked out over his land, the barns glowing orange in the fading light. "They picked the wrong ranch," Colby chuckled. "No kidding." But just when Jackson thought it was all over, a call came through his phone, a known number. He hesitated, then answered, "Mr. Miles, this is Deputy Crawley from the State's Special Investigations Unit. There's something else you need to know about Karen Prescott. We've been watching her for longer than you think." Jackson's brow furrowed. "Why? She's not just your whole president. She's tied to a land-grabbing scheme stretching 3 counties. Your bear incident might just crack something much bigger." Jackson looked at the horizon again, now dark, with stars just beginning to appear. He muttered under his breath, "Figures. To be continued. Shall I continue with Part 8? The final showdown and satisfying resolution." The courtroom was packed. Press, local ranchers, environmentalists, and a few wide-eyed jurors who clearly hadn't expected a case involving a bear, a fake HOA, and a nearly fatal scheme. Jackson sat quietly behind the prosecution's table, wearing his old flannel shirt like armor. His boots still had mud from the ranch. He hadn't dressed up. He didn't need to. Across the room, Karen Prescott and the 3 other HOA council members looked like wilted paper dolls. The bravado was gone. Their lawyers whispered with increasing panic as Jackson's legal team loaded up the final piece of evidence, a wildlife collar with a tracking chip. Jackson had found the collar deep in the ravine behind his barn, buried beneath leaves and claw marks. The same collar linked back to a local animal rescue facility owned by Karen's cousin. On paper, the bear had been rehomed. In truth, it had been transported in a tranquilized state, released at night on Jackson's ranch, and monitored with a GPS chip so the HOA could ensure maximum fear and relocation pressure. As they'd worded it in a recovered HOA email, the twist: the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service had been secretly watching since the bear was first spotted on Jackson's ranch. Karen's cousin had already been under investigation for illegal wildlife trafficking. What started as HOA harassment quickly escalated into federal charges. Jackson hadn't known just how big the spider web was until it started unraveling. The charges filed went beyond endangerment and trespassing. They included conspiracy to commit ecological sabotage, fraud, and obstruction of justice. Even Jackson's neighbor Dennis, the one who had stayed oddly quiet through the ordeal, was indicted for tampering with the game cameras. When the judge read the guilty verdict, Jackson didn't smile. He simply looked down, exhaled, and tipped his hat slightly. not in triumph but in relief. The sentencing was harsh. Karen received 5 years in federal prison, her cousin 10. The others got varying terms depending on their involvement. The judge's final words echoed through the courtroom. No one is above the law, not even those who think they're enforcing their own. Outside the courthouse, the press rushed Jackson. One reporter asked, "What made you keep going?" Most folks would have just sold the ranch and moved on. Jackson paused, looked out past the crowd toward the pine ridges that led back home. "I don't scare easy," he said, "and I don't run from my land. You stand your ground not just for yourself, but so no one else has to fight the same fight after you." Back at the ranch, things slowly returned to normal. Jackson fixed the barn where the bear had torn through a door. He repaired fences, cleaned up the broken camera traps, and even planted new trees where the land had been scarred. He didn't replace the old wooden sign that had once read "Welcome to Ridgeback Ranch." Instead, he carved a new one. "Bareback Ranch, we never back down." Neighbors who once stayed quiet began stopping by more often. Some brought pie, others brought apologies. One even offered to help start a community co-op so landowners could band together for support. Without relying on any HOA-type group, late one afternoon, Jackson sat on his porch sipping sweet tea. A new bear, this one tagged and monitored by the Forest Service, ambled by the tree line. Completely uninterested in the man on the porch, it was a reminder of what real wild looked like. Uncontrolled, sure, but honest. As the sun dipped, his phone buzzed. A message from his niece in Denver. She'd seen the whole story on the news. "Uncle Jax, you're a legend. You should start a channel or something, call it Ranch Justice." Jackson chuckled. Maybe he would, or maybe he'd just let the story live on, passed down like all good ranch stories. Stories about standing tall when the wild comes knocking, and what happens when you fight back the right way. Want more unbelievable HOA stories? Stick around and hit subscribe, because what happened to Jackson isn't just a story, it's a warning.